The Silent Challenge. The dojo was empty except for the two men who faced each other in the pale light of the lamps. The air smelled of sweat and leather and something else, something electric, like the calm before a storm. Chuck Norris, with his cold gaze and unwavering posture, crossed his arms over his broad chest. Bruce Lee, light as a breeze, barely seemed to touch the ground as he moved in small circles, his eyes fixed on his opponent. "They say you're fast," Chuck said, his voice deep, almost a growl. "But speed isn't everything." Bruce smiled, a flash of white teeth against tan skin. "Then test me." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown to the wind. Chuck Norris was a man who didn't back down, who faced lions with his bare hands and emerged from any confrontation unscathed. But there, in front of that man, small in stature but immense in presence, something in his instinct made him hesitate. Bruce didn't wait. In a movement so fluid you could barely see it, he advanced. There was no scream, no preparation, just the sound of a punch cutting through the air. Chuck reflexively blocked, but the impact sent him back half a step. Before he could react, Bruce was on the other side, his open hand hovering inches from his throat. "Did you feel that?" Bruce asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Chuck didn't respond. "Not because I didn't want to, but because, for the first time in years, I had no words." What had just happened was not just speed. It was something beyond surgical precision, absolute control of the body and space. Bruce hadn't just attacked, he had shown. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, Bruce retreated, returning to his starting position. The smile was still there, but now there was something different in his eyes, a calm certainty, as if he knew the challenge had already been won. Chuck Norris took a deep breath. He was a fighter, a warrior, a man who knew no fear. But in that moment, faced with that silent demonstration of mastery, he understood a simple truth: some things could not be overcome with brute force. Some things demanded respect. And for the first time in a long time, Chuck Norris was speechless. The silence among the warriors. The dojo was immersed in a silence so dense that even the wind, as it passed through the cracks in the wooden doors, seemed to hold its breath. Chuck Norris kept his fists clenched at his sides, his muscles still tense, as if he was expecting a new attack. But Bruce Lee didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly, as if he recognized something in the other's eyes, not surrender, but understanding. "You're not fast," Bruce said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "You are necessary. And this is more dangerous." Chuck exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the words. He had faced strong, fast, brutal men. But never someone who made him question his own nature. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, the realization that, somewhere between strength and technique, there was a chasm he had not yet crossed. "I didn't come here to lose," Chuck muttered, his voice hoarse. Bruce smiled, this time without irony. "Nobody comes. But sometimes, losing is the only way to gain something greater." The American frowned. He was not a man of metaphors. He dealt with facts, with actions. But there, in front of that man who seemed to anticipate every move before he even thought them, the words made sense in a way he couldn't explain. "What do you want?" asked Chuck finally. Bruce took a step back, creating space between them. "Let you see." And then, without warning, he moved again. Not an attack. Not a show of force. Just a gesture, a turn of the body, a sideways shift, as if the air around him was bending to accommodate him. Chuck followed the movement, eyes narrowed, trying to decipher the intention. But there was no intention. There was just fluidity. Suddenly, Bruce stopped. And he pointed to the floor. Between them, an invisible line seemed to have been drawn. Not on the mat, but in the space itself. Chuck looked down and, for the first time, he saw, the path Bruce had taken wasn't just a detour. It was a lesson. "Fighting isn't about hitting," Bruce said. "It's about not being beaten. And for that, you need to understand that the enemy is not the other. It's what you think you know." Chuck felt the weight of those words like a punch to the stomach. He had spent his life believing that strength was synonymous with victory. That resistance was the only answer. But there, in that moment, he realized that he had spent years fighting shadows, while the real fight was within himself. How? The question escaped before he could contain it. Bruce didn't respond right away. Instead, he extended his hand, offering it not as a challenge but as an invitation. Chuck hesitated, but then slowly accepted. The grip was firm but not competitive. It was a deal. "You already know," said Bruce. "You just need to stop fighting it." And just like that, without another word, the moment dissolved. Bruce backed away, returning to his initial stance, while Chuck remained where he was, his fingers still tingling from the contact. There was no victory. There was no defeat. Just the echo of a truth that, now, he would carry with him. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, turning the sky orange and red. Chuck Norris took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world, and the weight of himself, readjust. He didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. And that, in itself, was already a victory. Final chapter, The Weight of Stillness. The days that followed were not easy. Chuck returned to Bruce's dojo, but not as a student, nor as an adversary, as someone who finally understood that the fight was not against others, but against one's own reflection. Bruce didn't treat him with condescension, nor with veiled challenges. He just continued his training, as if the conversation between them had never happened. And perhaps it was exactly that, a lesson without words, a truth that only revealed itself in silence. Chuck, however, could no longer ignore the cracks in his life. The success, the fame, the image of invincibility, all of it now felt like rusty armor, too heavy to carry. He canceled appointments, declined interviews, and for the first time in decades, stopped running. There were no more enemies to defeat, no more records to break. There was just the emptiness of someone who realizes they've spent their entire life running away from themselves. One night, while walking through the streets of Los Angeles, the air humid and neon lights reflecting in puddles of water, he stopped in front of a small bar. It wasn't a place for celebrities or fighters. It was one of those establishments where people went to forget, or perhaps to remember. Chuck entered. The bartender, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, didn't even blink when he saw him. "What will it be?" he asked, drying a glass with a dirty cloth. "Something strong. But not as much as I deserve." The man poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a lowball glass. Chuck drank in silence, feeling the liquid burn his throat. It wasn't the fire of anger, nor the heat of adrenaline. It was just the bitter taste of reality. "You're Chuck Norris, right?" a voice interrupted. He turned around. A young man, no more than 20 years old, was standing beside him, his eyes shining with admiration. Chuck recognized that look. I'd seen it thousands of times, in fans, in students, even in opponents. It was the look of someone who wanted something from him. Strength. Courage. An answer. "I already went," he replied, placing some bills on the counter. "But I'm not anymore." The young man frowned, confused. Chuck didn't wait for the reaction. He left the bar and walked to the beach, where the waves crashed against the sand in a steady rhythm. The sea didn't ask for anything. I didn't judge. It didn't demand victories. It just existed. It was there, under a starless sky, that he finally understood what Bruce meant by "stop fighting it." It wasn't about giving up. It was about accepting that true strength was not in winning, but in knowing when the battle was over. The next morning, Chuck Norris disappeared. There were no announcements, no bombastic farewells. Just a note left on his agent's desk, no more, and an address on an envelope. When they opened it, they found the keys to a small plot of land in the interior of Texas, where a simple house was already built. No fences, no alarms, nothing to remind him of the world he left behind. The years passed. stories about his whereabouts emerged. Some said he lived as a monk in Tibet, others that he had become a hermit in the desert. The truth, however, was less romantic and quieter. Chuck Norris lived alone, growing a vegetable garden, mending fences, and sometimes sitting on the porch at dusk, watching the horizon. He still trained. Not to fight, but to move. Not to win, but to breathe. And on rare occasions, when the wind blew in the right direction, he swore he heard the echo of a familiar laugh, deep, patient, like that of a man who always knew that Chuck Norris' greatest battle was not against the world, but against himself. And finally, he had one. The silence and the shadows. The first years were the most difficult. Chuck Norris had chosen an isolated valley in the mountains of Colorado, where the air was thin and winter lasted longer than anywhere else. The cabin he built with his own hands was rustic but solid, made of pine logs and precisely stacked stones. There was no electricity, just oil lamps that flickered in the long nights. The water came from a nearby stream, cold and crystal clear, and he drank it straight from his cupped hands, as if the simple act of quenching his thirst was a ritual. At first, nightmares woke him up before dawn. They were always the same: the sound of bones breaking, the smell of blood mixed with dust, the weight of an inert body in his arms. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands shaking, and waited for the sweat to dry before getting up. Over time, he learned to tame sleep. Not with medicine, not with alcohol, things that had never been part of his life, but with discipline. Before going to sleep, I emptied my mind, repeating slow Tai Chi movements, as if each gesture were a key to lock the memories. The garden became his anchor. The first year, the seeds he planted barely sprouted, suffocated by the rocky soil. He studied, learned to read the signs of the earth, to understand when the moon was right to sow. The third summer he picked ruby red tomatoes and pumpkins so big he could barely carry one alone. It was a job that required patience, something he had never valued before. Each sprout that emerged was a small victory, proof that I was still capable of creating, not just destroying. People in the nearest town, almost 50 kilometers away, knew of his presence, but kept their distance. Some hunters saw him from afar, a tall, motionless figure against the horizon, watching the movement of the clouds. Others swore they saw him carrying a wounded deer on his back, as if the animal were as light as a child. Rumors spread that he was a ghost, a man without a past, a saint who had renounced the world. Chuck listened to these stories and smiled and sighed. It wasn't like that at all. Just a man trying to live without leaving a trace. Once a month, I went down to town to buy supplies, flour, salt, tools. He always paid in cash, always avoided conversations. But once, an old shopkeeper, with gnarled hands and pale eyes, stared at him for longer than necessary. "You're him, aren't you?" he asked, bluntly. Chuck didn't respond. He just placed the coins on the counter and waited for the change. "My grandson has a scar on his arm," continued the man, as if that explained everything. "He says it was you who saved him, somewhere in the East. I don't know if I believe half of the things he says, but, thank you." Chuck grabbed the bags and left without looking back. That night, for the first time in years, he dreamed of the past. Not with fights, not with deaths, but with a scared-eyed boy holding an injured arm as he wrapped a clean cloth around the cut. He woke up with the taste of salt in his mouth. Asterisk. The winter of the 10th year was the harshest he had ever faced. Snow covered the cabin halfway to the windows, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. He spent days without leaving, eating canned food and dry firewood. One particularly cold night, he heard a scratch at the door. When he opened it, he found a thin, gray wolf, with yellow eyes shining in the darkness. The animal didn't growl, it didn't advance. He just stood there, shaking. Chuck hesitated. He knew that wolves didn't approach humans without reason. But something about the animal's posture, the low tail, the floppy ears, told him it wasn't a threat. He left the door open and went back inside. The wolf entered slowly, as if testing the waters, and huddled near the wood stove. In the following days, the animal remained. Chuck gave him scraps of food, and the wolf, in return, didn't bother him. One night, however, while Chuck was sleeping, the wolf approached the bed and let out a low whine. He woke up at the same time as a loud bang echoed outside. Snow had fallen on the shed where he kept his tools, and part of the roof was about to give way. Chuck ran outside, the wolf close behind. They worked together, he shoveling the snow with his hands, the animal digging with its paws, until the danger was over. When he was done, Chuck sat down in the snow, exhausted. The wolf approached and placed its nose on his shoulder, as if to say, "It's okay." He never knew the name of the animal, but he called it Shadow. And, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Asterisk. The years continued to pass, marked only by the seasons. The cabin gained a new room, a bookshelf full of books, philosophy, poetry, agricultural manuals. Chuck read by lamplight, underlining passages that spoke about redemption, about the weight of carrying a past. On one of the pages of an old copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, he wrote in firm handwriting, "True strength lies not in overcoming others, but in not being defeated by oneself." One morning, when he woke up, he realized that Sombra was no longer there. He searched for days, calling for the animal, but found no sign. In the end, he understood that the wolf had left as he had lived, in silence, without goodbyes. Chuck sat on the porch and stayed there until the sun went down, feeling the emptiness that absence left. But there was no sadness. Just the acceptance that some things arrived to teach us something and then went their way. Asterisk. In the 20th year of his exile, a letter reached him. There was no sender, just his name handwritten on a yellowed envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a short message. "They still talk about you. Some say you died. Others say you never existed. But I know the truth. And I know you do too. Thank you." Chuck recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from an old friend, one of the few left from the times when the world knew his name. He burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the flames devour the words until only ash remained. That night, for the first time in 2 decades, he picked up the phone he kept stored in a wooden box. It was an old device, with no signal, but it still worked for one last call. He dialed a number he knew by heart, even though he hadn't used it in years. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was hoarse, tired. "It's Chuck." Silence. Then a low, almost incredulous laugh. "I thought you were dead." "Almost. And now?" Chuck looked out the window, at the snow-capped mountains, at the starry sky that stretched endlessly. "Now, I'm ready." He hung up before the other could respond. There was nothing more to say. Asterisk. Last winter was different. He felt his body slower, his bones heavier. It wasn't pain, just the weight of years. One morning, he woke up with difficulty breathing. I knew what was happening, but there was no fear. Just an eerie calm, like everything finally made sense. Prepared. He lit the stove, made coffee, wrote one last entry in his diary. The greatest fight is not against others. It is against the man we were. And, sometimes, winning means stopping fighting. Then he sat in the rocking chair on the porch, with a blanket over his shoulders. The sun was rising, turning the mountains golden. He closed his eyes and let the wind carry away what was left. When they found him, days later, he was sitting up as if he were sleeping. The gray wolf was next to him, lying at his feet, also motionless. No one could say how long the two stayed there, together, under the infinite sky. And, somewhere, a familiar laugh echoed, deep, patient, like that of a man who always knew that Chuck Norris' greatest victory was not over the world, but over the shadow he carried within himself.